Hello, it's Ruby and welcome back to the Pluviophile Papers. Today we are going to be looking at pens, the history of pens, early pens, and the evolution of pens. As you can probably guess, there is a very fascinating history behind pens. These items that we use every day on a daily basis, and it's one of the most useful, if not the most useful tools that we have. So we are going to start in ancient Egypt. So, of course, the ancient Egyptians famously carved messages, stories into rock with hieroglyphics, and that was until about 3000 BCE. And then they developed reed pens. So reed pens work a tiny bit like kind of more modern dipping pens, in that you dip them in ink. However, caveat, there are also records of reed pens which would be set into clay, so they'd be the reed would be used to write in clay. So basically a piece of reed would be soaked in water and then it would be cut. It would be cut into the shape of a nib, and the top would be flattened. And when I say flattened, if you look at these two types of nib, I don't know if it's going to focus, I might have to do a separate clip. On these two pens, this one has a flat nib and this one has a pointed nib. And so when I say a square end, it's talking more to this flat end shape. And then finally, of course, adding a little slit in the top so that the ink can be held and it can actually write. Now, there are two types of reed pen which existed for the ancient Egyptians. We have got the Calamos reed pen and the Rush reed pen. And there is a really interesting paper by Packard-Grams who looks at the way that both of these reed pens changes the act of writing. And of course this is intuitive, right? Depending on what pen you're using, your handwriting is going to be different. When you use a fountain pen versus a ballpoint pen or a gel pen, your handwriting changes, and this is exactly what Packard-Grams explores. So he studies how the pens differ. The Calamos reed pen, which is the one that we're mainly going to be talking about, uses liquid ink. So, when you've got an inkwell and you've got liquid ink, that's what the Calamos reed pen would use. But the Rush reed pen used a more solid kind of ink, more like watercolour paints. And so we can actually identify what kind of pen was being used by the ink stains, because if you're using ink like this, and as my hands can testify because they are always covered in stains of this, you are going to leave ink stains in different places, whereas a solid pigment is not going to do that. So actually it's really interesting how the ink can materially tell us what pen was being used. And this idea builds on something which Overman and Wynne write, and I'm going to read it to you because it's good contextually. They say it takes massive distributed participation and cultural spans of time to develop and refine a technology like writing. Change becomes invisible, whether the change is material, behavioural or neural. Each generation merely uses its material culture and often fails to notice as both it and they change in the process. Material change can represent increased efficiency in changing brains and behaviours. It also represents the accretion of social knowledge, which reduces cognitive effort by distributing past and present effort to the current and succeeding generations. And this is pointing to the really key question, which I think sits at the heart of us studying pens at all, that this is the vehicle, this is the vessel through which we are writing. And so what Overman and Wynne are suggesting here is that the equipment which is used to write actually ends up having an effect on the act itself, and that we can't remove the physical act of writing from the finalized, I'm looking for a piece of writing, from the finalized product that's written. And I just think that's so interesting. Okay, anyway though, reed pens problematically lose their flat point very easily. They're worn down very easily. So Ellen Swift, for example, has analysed the handwriting from reed pens, and she notes that when we look at the text and we look at the handwriting, the changes in it show us that the nib was, quote, constantly diminishing, because the handwriting keeps on changing as it's being used. We can actually on the paper see the nib wearing down. And actually Ellen Swift experimented with different reed pens and shapes of reed pens to get a sense of what pens were writing what documents, which I just think is such exciting research. I just had to say that because it's so cool. So those are reed pens. I want to tell you about feather quills, which are certainly the most discussed early pens in media. Like everyone's heard of feather pens, feather quills. And there is a wonderful quote by Leonardo da Vinci, which I just can't not tell you. He says, "Feathers shall raise men even as they do birds towards heaven, that is, by letters written with their quills." Again, pointing to the power of pens, the importance of pens. There is evidence of quills being used as early as the 2nd century BCE. That was for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Reed pens and cane pens were used in the West, but feather quills grew in popularity and kind of became the most popular kind of pen in about 600 BCE. The feathers were usually taken from large birds, so birds like geese and swans. And actually, fascinatingly, the word pen is actually linked to feathers. So pen comes from the French pen and the Latin penna. And originally, penna in the Latin refers to flight, to feathers, to quills. Penna is Latin for feather. And so the actual word pen links us directly etymologically to feather quills and feather pens. Now, the feather quill, unlike the reed pen, crucially retains its shape much better. And this means that it doesn't have to be sharpened all of the time. Just imagine, like, you're writing all the time already, like now, because we're so used to having fountain pens and pens with like cartridges, just dipping between the ink feels time consuming. So imagine if halfway through your document you have to get out a knife and carve your pen again. It's not very practical at all. So a feather quill is very similar to the reed pen in that you will carve the top and then you create a slit at the end. I can make a whole nother video on how to make quills and looking at kind of 17th century guidebooks and tutorials on creating feather quills, because those in themselves are very interesting. But for now, I will just quote one thing from Giovanni Antonio Tagliente, who says, quote, "A good quill should have 5 qualities. It should be large of its kind, i.e. according to the species of bird from which it is taken. It should be hard, be round, be narrow, and be taken from the right wing, so that it does not bend in the wrong direction when you hold it in your hand." Of course, that's speaking to the superiority of the right hand over the left hand. And he says, "Feathers taken from the wild goose are very good, but those of the domestic goose are much better than all the rest." And most quills would come from geese, which farms actually kept. So geese might be kept for meat, for eggs, or for feathers, for pillows and things. And so from those geese that people kept, they might also get their quills, but they would also be exported from Eastern Europe. Of course, in this video, we have completely neglected many pens. I've chosen to focus on reed pens, kind of transitioning into feather quills, but of course there are also ink brush pens, which were very popular in China. So they started to be used in about 1000 BCE, and there is so much rich history and interesting legend around ink brush pens. But we didn't focus on that in this video. We were looking more at nibbed pens. As I say, that is just a very brief overview of feather quills and reed pens. I really hope you found this interesting, and do let me know if there is anything that you want a video about, if there's any aspect of literary history or book history that you're fascinated by, and then perhaps I can make it as a video. But anyway, thank you so much for watching.